where reflection involves a kind of mediation between the self we are, the self we think we are, the self we want to be, and the self we imagine, and the self others respond to. Right? Knowing the self or oneself is a kind of millennial question that extends over thousands of years, and it seems to me today, 2019, on the one hand we're more and more invested in a self. These are selfies, for instance, right? And self-promotion, self-branding, the discussion of identity, personal identity, national identity. But on the other hand, what the self is seems more and more perplexing, more and more disturbing, more and more unsettling. And I'm going to posit one view and then set mine up against that. Okay, so one view would have it that we have a little core self inside of ourselves that is basically unified, at one with itself, harmonious, total, complete, full. It's kind of the, what should I say, the acorn view, where we have a little kernel, a seed inside of ourselves that is our basic self, our true self, our most authentic self. And that can be found, there's in Western thought, there's a fellow named Parmenides who can be taken to have said something like that, although I'm not sure he did really. But it's the view that many people take about their authentic selves, that there must be one true, real, whole, unified person inside me. If I could only find that, I could be happy and be my true self. So that's one view of selfhood. But the view of selfhood that I've been pushing here is radically opposed to that. And that is that we are in our very core split. Now, again, Jung is at the table on this. Carl Jung says we have at least two sides, the light side and the shadow side, and then it turns out we have four, right? So there are multiple dimensions in Jungian thought. I would say we have many. I wouldn't put a number on it, but I would start from an initial split, I would say, between the self into which we are thrown. This would be our family, our language, our culture, our neighborhood, our environment, our tradition, our class, our gender, right? In my family, I had a very powerful father, a little guy. Little guys are often Napoleonic in their aspirations. He was an American businessman in the time of American globalization. And I grew up in sharp resistance to this. For me, this was always horrifying, quite terrifying. I questioned him repeatedly, well, what did you do in the office today, Dad? And all he ever said was, shuffle papers. Never got any more information than that. So very early on, I used his own library as a way of resisting him and coming up with an alternative self-understanding. This is where I came into Nietzsche. Nietzsche was in his library. Kafka was in his library. Homer, many of the canonical works in the West. And began reading these writers as a way of, basically of resistance. So mental selfhood for me begins, in my experience, at a moment of resistance, at a moment of saying, no, I'm not that way, I'm this way. You see? And so self-definition in a way is almost pathological in the sense that it involves differentiation. Not that way, but this way. So I believe that self-formation begins for many, not for all, but for many, in response to one's family and in a kind of resistance to one's family. I'm not, again, I'll just mention his name one more time. I'm not going to support Freud's idea here that, you know, men have to kill off the father and have sex with the mother. That seems a bit extreme, but if you reduce the terms and think of it as articulating one's position in relation to one's parents, I think that can become a useful starting point for thinking about the mental development, evolution, proliferation of the self. Classes, I ask the students to do two written assignments. The first is on the question, what is the self? / who are you? Or what or who is the other? Right? And I've had hundreds of examples of writing on this, and it's always astonishing to me how people, I would say 65-70% of the responses I get end up saying there is no self, I have no self, I'm completely dominated by others, family, social media, and so forth. So I would say there's a crisis of thinking of selfhood today that is, in my view, truly exacerbated by social media and, you know, the pressure to have a self and to identify the self. So the students that I see are generally quite marvelous, very ambitious. You both know this from UBC. UBC students are ambitious, aggressive, driven, compulsive, obsessed in their own way. But the saddest part of it, in my view, is anxiety. There's tremendous anxiety I find in the students I see today, perhaps in your generation. Anxiety over the planet, the nation, the culture, themselves, their family. I don't remember being so anxious in 1971. I remember being mad. We were angry. I was resisting the Vietnam War. I was resisting American militarism. I was mad at my family. I was mad at my town, my culture. But I wasn't anxious. I just figured my own passionate commitment would find a way, right? And I believe we're in a situation now where people, especially younger people, are so anxious that there's almost a kind of paralysis that emerges, where people become so filled with self-doubt and anxiety and uncertainty that it's hard to know what to do at all at any point. And at that point, again, I like to remind people that actually, well, you're free. You can choose. This is Sartre, you know, we're free, so create, invent. We can all become the artists of our lives if we choose that. The best way to go is to try different things and find out what it is you won't do. And the more you do that, the closer you get to what it is you would do, right? So part of this evolution of the mental self that I was talking about is part of a process of elimination, a process of negation, whereby I would argue, and this is also in Hegel, we learn the most from tarrying with, spending time with the negative and thinking about, you know, what is most negative for us and how it would respond to that. And that's exactly how I came to be a professor. Directly, self-understanding through a process of negation, a process of, I would go further and say, critical thinking, and developing through critical thinking, and I would say a kind of exploration, investigation, experimentation within different forms of life, leads to a kind of growth, a kind of complexity that can be very satisfying. It can also be very disturbing because it often feels as if, you know, it would be nice to have one single focus or obsession, but it takes, in my experience, it takes a long time to understand what one's obsession really is. it was around the age of 50 that I understood, for example, even though I'd fought my father since I was about 5, when I was 5 I realized he and I were very different. And then I was walking downtown in Vancouver one day, a rainy day when I was 50. And you know how there are a number of glass windows along Granville there, downtown, right? And I was walking quickly along. And suddenly I thought to my right, in the shadow, this would be my shadow self for Jung. Yeah. I saw this figure who I thought was my father. I thought, what is he doing here, right? And I looked over and it was me. I was walking like he walks. And I realized, uh-oh, I am my father. As much as I fought him, I am him. I have become him now, right? And so there's a way in which this very process of resistance that I was talking about before brings one, I think, over time into a process of coexistence, a kind of sympathetic understanding in a way, whereby the very antagonisms one may have created or imagined at a certain stage tend to melt away and become more accepted, more recognized, and more internalized as parts of this growing and changing selfhood. By the time I graduated from high school, I graduated in 1970, I remember sitting in this graduation ceremony vowing I would never go to school again. That school was a place of brainwashing and class training and elitism and nothing but pomposity and foolishness and stupidity and arrogance and so forth, right? And I just thought school was the worst, right? And then I thought, okay, what would be the best then, right? And I thought it would be the life of a worker. By the time, so 5 years out of high school, I realized several things I didn't want to do. Through that entire time, I'd been taking classes at different schools in different areas of interest. I'd studied piano. My first year, I was trained as a pianist, as a classical pianist growing up. I was going to be a performance pianist until my teacher said, your hands are too small, you should give it up. And I said, but I can get to 10, you know, two notes over an octave. And he said, you got to get to 12. I said, okay. And then I studied French. So I went from piano to French to creative writing to history to English to philosophy to German, and went to 9 different schools, had 6 different majors depending on the school, and finally graduated with a BA in 1981. So it took me 11 years. And that's what I always recommend to people. One learns more, the more you slow it down, the more you think through different opportunities, different forms of knowledge, different ways of thinking, kinds of being, right? You know, when you see these people who put up pictures on Facebook and so forth and say, this is really who I am, no, I really am this way, I would see this as a kind of mirroring, taking the mirror self too seriously and imposing it on oneself. I would recommend rather that one attend to the differences that we go through every day in terms of different moods, different responses, different reactions, and recognize those moments of friction, of tension, of oscillation between different sides of the self. The moment of recognition when I realized I am my father was it was a moment of release for me. I realized that the fight with him hadn't been entirely negative, that it had also had a productive side. And so it's a kind of embracing of the tension, an acceptance of the tension, a recognition of the tension, and an acknowledgement of the tension, whereby these splits within the self become productive and become, I think, freeing. Because you can always think to yourself, you know what, I could have been different. I can be different. I can do different things. I don't have to do just one thing. And for me, this is a situation that your generation especially, and the generation of my grandchildren, would do well to embrace. I think instead of seeing yourselves as having one job forever through your lifetime and being one kind of person through your lifetime, I think you'll be much happier, much more productive, much more successful in the way of fulfillment if you can accept you'll probably do many different things and probably explore many different ways of living over time. Acknowledgement of this fluidity, which I think is one of the marvelous things about being alive, really. And something I would definitely encourage people to embrace.